Most people regard Romans as the Apostle Paul's magnum opus, his theological masterpiece, and it is certainly that. But it's important in studying it to remember that it's first and foremost an actual letter. So there's the usual, who it's from and who it's to. There's an opening blessing, a greeting, and then there's some basic information sharing before Paul gets to the reason that he wrote, the substance of his correspondence. In verses 11 through 17, which we're going to cover in this episode, Paul completes the opening section of the letter and then transitions into its body. In verse 10, he tells the Romans that he hopes and he prays that he'll be able to visit them. And then he gives 3 reasons that he wanted to. Verse 11, "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me." The first reason that Paul wanted to see them was to bring and to be a blessing to them. Paul had gifts that he knew would build them up. His preaching and teaching were anointed. He knew that the Roman Christians would benefit from what he had to share. Now, later in the letter, Paul warns against pride. And the way that he says it, I think, is insightful. He says, quote, "I say through the grace given to me to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith," unquote. As C.S. Lewis said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Humility is having a sense of who and what we really are, defining ourselves by what God sees and says. Paul knew he was an apostle, as the earlier verses make clear. He knew that he had a calling to plant and build healthy churches. Facilitating that calling were the gifts to get it done, because where God guides, he provides. Paul wanted the Roman church to be a healthy, vibrant community of faith and knew that he could help make it so. What are you called to? What's your ministry? Whatever it is, God's gifted you to get it done and done well. You may not be an apostle with an apostle's gifts, but you are something with gifts to be an excellent something. Mother, father, wife, husband, friend, mentor, student, whatever. But Paul's view of calling and gifting wasn't one-sided. He wasn't the only one with gifts. He knew that the Romans had gifts that he would be blessed by. He could both bless and be blessed by them. This is one of the things that I've come to so appreciate in being a part of God's church, how God uses others in so many marvelous ways. Hospitality is an amazing gift that brings huge blessing. The gift of mercy is so needed when someone is suffering. The gift of giving, of resourcing initiatives and works that expand God's kingdom, it's spectacular. This is why being a part of a local fellowship is so important. The Christian life is a community affair. It's not meant to be done alone. If theology was all that was needed, then sending this letter would have been enough. But no, Paul wanted to go to Rome and to be with them. Verse 13, "Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. I am a debtor, both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise." The second reason that Paul wanted to visit Rome was a sense of obligation. He saw the lost, whatever their identity, as people that he owed the gospel to. The couth and the uncouth, the civilized, uncivilized, educated and unlettered. Paul was compelled to tell them the good news. Like hundreds of thousands of young Americans the day after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, Alan Emery enlisted in the military. He signed up for the Coast Guard and was put to work as a quartermaster in Boston. One Friday night, getting ready to start guard duty, his buddy Joe Olszewski stopped by. He was wearing his dress blues and was squared away. Joe looked sharp. Emery asked where Olszewski was headed, looking so snazzy. Joe replied that the night before he had met a wealthy girl who had invited him to her house for the weekend because her parents were going to be gone, the liquor cabinet was full, and they would have the house to themselves. Olszewski had a weekend pass and said that he would be back Monday. He said, "Oh, this is going to be the best weekend of my life." Alan Emery was a Christian, a genuine, real-deal Jesus follower. He said, "Well, Joe, I'll be praying for you." Olszewski replied, "What did you say?" Emery said, "I said I'd be praying for you." Olszewski asked, "Why will you be praying for me when I'm going to have a great time?" Emery replied, "Because, Joe, Monday morning you'll be back aboard ship and you won't be the same person you are tonight because sin leaves a mark." Well, Olszewski cursed Emery and left. Emery began praying. A couple of hours later, an unsmiling and agitated Joe Olszewski appeared in the floodlights of the guard post. He asked, "How can I have a good time when someone's praying for me? You've ruined my weekend. I stood up my date and I've been wandering around until now, thinking about what you said. Tell me, Em, how do I find God?" Olszewski became a follower of Jesus that night. And he was so earnest in his faith, he immediately joined a church and began sharing the gospel with other servicemen. Many of them came to faith. A year later, he volunteered to serve on a minesweeper that was torpedoed and sunk by a German sub. Alan Emery saw in Joel Olszewski someone to whom he owed a debt, and he paid it by sharing the gospel. And just in time, because it became the means of Joe's eternal life. It was Paul's hope to go to Rome, but none of his plans worked out. Take note of that. It's a valuable lesson about how Paul saw the intersection of God's will and his own. From the book of Acts and what he says here, we get the idea that Paul's view of faithfulness worked rather like this. He was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and he sought to be faithful to that wherever he was. When he heard of a place without a church, he saw it as an opportunity. But he was also strategic. He considered the best places to set up shop so that he could reach as many as possible as quickly as possible. Antioch in Syria was a good place to begin. Antioch of Pisidia was strategic in reaching the entire region of Galatia. Philippi, Athens, Corinth, these were essential to securing Greece. Ephesus was the door to all of Asia, and so he spent over 3 years there. But the richest spot of all was Rome. It was the heart of the empire. If all roads lead to Rome, then all roads lead from it as well. And so he made his plans and tried to go. But as happened when he tried to go into Asia on his second missionary journey, God shut the door. It was 3 years before Paul finally made it to Rome. And when he did, it was at Rome's expense because he went as a prisoner. The point is this: Paul didn't sit on his hands, agonizing in prayer about where to go before he went. He knew that he was called to go. It was in that going, as he walked in the Spirit, that the Lord would steer him. If God has called you, do something. Start moving and watch how God directs your steps. You can't steer a parked car. Get moving. And one more thing. In verse 13, Paul says that he had been hindered in going to Rome. And we ask, by whom? Maybe it was chance, circumstance. Maybe it was Satan. But the point is, God turned it to good. By the time that we're done with Romans, however long that takes, we're going to be very thankful for that hindrance. We should be now because the letter has been crucial in the history of the faith. Martin Luther would not have started the Reformation were it not for Romans. But this letter would not have been written for us to study if Paul's original plans had come to pass. He wrote this letter precisely because he had been hindered from going to Rome. What Satan meant for harm, God turned to good. Verse 15, so as much as is in me, and what he means there is, with everything that's inside of me, so as much as is in me, I am ready or eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. Now here's the third reason that Paul wanted to visit Rome. Here's the truth that had utterly transformed his life and could transform any and everyone's life. We find it in verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Paul knew down to the very core of his being that the gospel is what people need. He was utterly convinced of that, so much so that he'd given his entire life to it. Literally. Sharing the gospel was his entire agenda, his sole ambition. Not even the threat of death could stop him. Acts 14 tells us some years before, Paul was stoned to death in the city of Lystra for preaching the gospel. And when God raised him from the dead, he went back into the city where they had just killed him. When a mob at Ephesus wanted to tear Paul apart, he tried to preach to them. It was only the intervention of friends talking some sense into him that saved him. Paul knew when he preached the gospel that not everyone would respond, but some would. And those who did, well, watch out. A mighty change was coming to rock their world. Because, as he says here, the gospel is the power of God to save everyone who believes it. It had saved and changed Paul. He was a one-time Pharisee, a Jew of Jews, fanatical in his devotion to the law of Moses, a hater of Christians with their stupid but dangerous blasphemy from Paul's perspective. So opposed to the gospel was Paul that he hunted down Christians and imprisoned them. Having driven the church underground with his campaign of terror, he was on his way to the city of Damascus to start a campaign there when Jesus appeared to him. In a flash, Paul realized that he was on the wrong side. He went from being a determined persecutor of the gospel to a committed proclaimer of it. His conversion was so complete that he ended up being the one put in prison for following Jesus. He went from being a hater to a lover. Before his conversion as a faithful Jew, Paul hated Gentiles. The last thing that he wanted to do was spend eternity in heaven with them. After his conversion, he wanted them all there, and he gave himself night and day, telling them how to get there. Put him in chains in prison, and he's just going to tell the jailer and the other prisoners how to go to heaven. Paul knew the power of God to save because he'd been saved, and he'd seen others saved. The religious and irreligious, the educated and unlettered, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, masters and slaves, men and women, seniors and children. No one was beyond the reach of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel didn't just gain them heaven, it transformed them as it had him. It turned them from haters to lovers. It healed the brokenhearted. It restored hope to the hopeless and turned gross sinners into, well, remarkable saints. That's why Paul says that he wasn't ashamed of the gospel. He knew it as the power of God to save. There's so much there, so much. A far better mind and tongue than mine is needed to do it justice. Christians were not held in high regard when Paul wrote this. They were deemed fools. Pagans thought them atheists because they believed in only one God instead of many. Greeks called them naive for believing in the resurrection. Romans despised followers of Christ as weak because they forgave rather than got even. Christians set humble service over cruel ambition. And everyone could not understand how Christians could worship a God who died an ignominious death on a Roman cross of all things. Their gods and goddesses did occasionally take human form, but only so they could, well, cuddle up to some attractive human. But to serve? Die? Never! That was absurd. In the catacombs of Rome is some ancient graffiti. One has a slave bowing before a cross on which hangs an ass. Under it is written, Alexamenus worships his God. The 2nd century critic Celsus wrote a bitter attack on Christianity. He said, quote, "Let no cultured person draw near, none wise, none sensible, for all that kind of thing that we count evil. But if any man is ignorant, if any man is wanting in sense and culture, if any is a fool, let him come boldly to Christianity," unquote. You liken Christians to a swarm of bats, or to ants crawling out of their nests, or frogs holding a symposium around a swamp, worms cowering in the muck. That's how he described them. Paul was imprisoned in Philippi and chased out of Thessalonica for preaching the gospel. He had been smuggled out of Damascus and Berea. He was laughed at and called insane by the elite of Athens. The Corinthians called him a fool. In Jerusalem, he was declared a blasphemer and condemned to death. Yet here he says that he is not ashamed of the gospel of Christ because it is the power of God to save. By the way, it still is. Listen, salvation is what the world needs. It doesn't need a new government program. It doesn't need more gadgets and toys. It needs Jesus. The problem is sin. The solution is the gospel. Paul knew that and would not allow fear or shame to shut him up. We can't either. It matters not that people don't want to hear the gospel. They didn't in Paul's day. It matters not that the gospel offends. Of course people don't want to hear that they're sinners who need a savior. I was offended when I first heard that, as you probably were. But it was true. And eventually that truth offended me right into faith in Christ. Look at it again. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. While salvation is potentially for everyone, it's only those who believe the gospel of Christ who are saved. Paul didn't shun to share the gospel out of a concern for those who wouldn't believe. He was ever on the lookout for those who would. Everyone was already lost and on the way to an eternity in hell. Paul knew that only by preaching the gospel would some find heaven instead. Imagine someone who gives up fishing because of all the fish that won't be caught. There's no such person. You go fishing for the few that do bite. How many Christians don't share the gospel because of those who won't believe? They already don't believe. Don't let the fear of their continued unbelief stop you from sharing Christ. There are people you know who are lost, who will never believe, but there are some who will. If only you share the one message that can save them, the one that has the power of God in it, the good news of Jesus. Again, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. God is not more interested in saving Jews than Gentiles. It's just that the Jews ought to have been better prepared since they were the ones that God had worked through to bring the gospel. Jesus was, after all, Jewish. So why didn't more Jews believe in Jesus? And the answer to that lies in verse 17. For in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, the rest of Romans is Paul's commentary on that. It's the pivotal point of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Note carefully that Paul speaks here of the righteousness of God. That phrase marks a huge transformation in Paul's thinking. You see, all of his life as a Jewish Pharisee, Paul wanted to be right with God. He thought he could be by keeping the law. The commandments were, stepping stones into God's favor. Righteousness was something that he was responsible for, something to be forged by good works, and he had plenty of them. Paul was a good Pharisee, a Jew among Jews, a religious zealot. In Romans chapter 7, Paul says, as he took inventory of the 10 commandments, that he did great until he got to the last one. So run through them, know God but God. Okay, check. Keep the Sabbath, check. Don't murder, easy peasy. No adultery, done. Number 10, don't covet. Why? What's wrong with coveting as long as I don't act on it? Paul reasoned, God's concerned with my thought life, not just my actions. And if that's the case, maybe adultery and murder are back on the list. Paul realized that God didn't give the law to make him righteous, but to make plain that he's not and never could be by his own effort. The law, the commandments aren't a means to be righteous. They're a mere revealing we're not. And then he remembered the words of the prophet Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith, not works, faith. That's what the very first Jew, Abraham, had done, as his story in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 makes clear. We read, Abraham believed God, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. Paul realized the righteousness that he needed, it wasn't the result of his own efforts. Indeed, it wasn't his righteousness at all. The righteousness that he needed was God's, and it comes through faith in Jesus. Jesus lived the sinless life we couldn't, then went to the cross to pay the debt our sin earns. Here's the gospel, the good news. In a glorious exchange, Jesus takes our sin and gives us his righteousness. We each individually enter that by believing it. And that is what Paul is going to unpack in detail in the rest of the letter.